In just 20 minutes, I'm going to show you how to master photography. If you're like I was 8 years ago and you want to take photos and maybe make a little bit of side money, take senior portraits, make your Instagram feel more professional, become a full-time photographer, or even just take better pictures of your family, this video is for you. The point is, when this clock hits 0, you will have full confidence and have mastered photography. We're going to be talking about how to properly set up your camera, how to take the correct exposure. We're going to be talking about lighting, lenses, poses, composition, flash photography, styles, editing, and we're even going to be giving you guys some editing presets that we love to use. This video will be the ultimate guide to mastering photography. Of course, I do have a limited amount of time in this video, so we're going to be moving rather quickly. I'd encourage you to grab a pen and a pencil if you want to take notes, maybe even pause this video if you need to. In this video, we're going to be talking about the basics of photography, but if you'd like to know even more, you can check out our full course at tomorrowsfilmmakers.com. We have over 1,200 training videos and over 120 hours of content on every single filmmaking subject you can possibly imagine by leading professionals in the film industry, including my in-depth photography course where I go more in-depth with weddings, portraits, job shadows, settings, editing, and more. Instead of offering this course at a crazy high price tag, right now we are offering our entire lifetime membership to our award-winning online academy, which includes our photography course, for only $97. Seriously, with the information that you will learn inside our course, you could literally go out tomorrow and schedule a senior portrait with somebody for $100 and get your money back. So basically, it's free. If you have friends or someone you know getting married, you could even shoot their wedding for like $1,000. And in today's market, they would actually be getting a steal. It really is that simple. That being said, let's jump into it. Countdown begins right now. I'll just answer the main question right at the beginning. It does not matter which camera brand you're using or even how nice your camera is. This photo was taken with a camera that costs $5,000 and it still looks like garbage. But this photo was taken with a camera that costs $100 and it looks great. That's because it's not about the camera. It's about the settings and the skills behind the camera. I mean, seriously, look at the difference. So when you're out camera shopping, trying to find the best camera you can think of, the main thing you're looking for is 1, does it have detachable lenses? And 2, does it have a manual mode? You need to be able to shoot in manual mode so that you can control your settings when you're shooting. So whatever camera you have, even if it's just an iPhone, set your camera to M mode and give yourself full controls over your camera. We're not gonna let the camera decide the exposure, we are going to take full control. Now, the very first thing you need to understand when it comes to shooting photos in manual mode is what we call the exposure triangle. Your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. You need to juggle all 3 of these at the same time to get the correct exposure on your camera. It's crucial that you learn all of these things together as it relates to photography. These pillars do also apply to videography, but for still photos, you need to think about them in a very specific way. And remember this is probably the most important thing I'll say in this entire video, and you might have heard of these before and know a few of them, but we're going to be talking about them briefly so you fully understand how to use them. The first thing to go over is your shutter speed. Your shutter speed on your camera is how long your image is exposed to the world. With a typical DSLR camera, the sensor inside your camera is what sees the world and captures that image onto an SD card, but there is a shutter in front of the sensor that keeps it from seeing anything, just like an eyelid to your camera. When the shutter opens, it allows the sensor to see the world, and when it closes, that is 1 picture taken. This number typically appears as a fraction on the back of your camera right about here. Now, the shutter speed affects 2 things. First off, the longer your shutter is open, the more light it's going to let onto the sensor. Slow shutter speed, bright image; fast shutter speed, darker image. But your shutter speed also affects your motion blur. If something is moving quickly and you're taking a photo of it, you're going to want a faster shutter speed to freeze that motion. If your shutter opens and someone runs past you and then your shutter closes, it's going to capture them running from one side of the frame to the other, resulting in a big smear across the photo. You would need a faster shutter speed to capture them running and actually freeze them in time. The exact number you need to be at totally depends on your environment, and more importantly, you need to ask the question, how much is my subject moving, and then set your shutter speed accordingly. The second piece of the exposure triangle is your aperture. Aperture is what we call the eyeball of your camera. The aperture, or the f-stop, same thing, regulates how much the lens will open up and how much light will be into your camera. Just like an eyeball dilating to allow less light and more light into your eyes for you to see, the lower the aperture number, the more light that is going to be let into your camera, resulting in a brighter image. And the higher the number, the aperture will actually close, resulting in a darker image because it's letting less light in. But the aperture will also affect one more thing, and that is your depth, or really how blurry your background is and what is actually in focus. When you open up the aperture, you automatically let more light into your camera, but your background also becomes much more out of focus. Anytime people ask me, how do I get that blurry background? I always tell them, lower your aperture. That's why lenses that have the availability to go to lower apertures are generally a lot more expensive, because getting that blurry background is something photographers are always striving for. And finally, the last setting is your ISO. This is a simple way to add more light to your image digitally. The higher the number, the brighter the image, and the lower the number, the darker the image. It's 100% artificial, but it's there if you need it. However, if you introduce a really high ISO number, you're going to start to see a lot of grain and noise in your image. For video, this is a huge deal, and this is unusable because it actually looks like TV static in your video. With photography though, it's something to avoid, but it's definitely not as bad because the grain isn't moving. On top of that, in Lightroom, there's also a denoise button that uses AI to get rid of the noise. It takes like 10 seconds, but I use it all the time, so really noise isn't a big issue for photography. But if you do get grain or noise in your image, it can almost look like a style or some vintage film look. Either way, the point is, use your ISO when needed, but try to keep it as low as possible. The good news is, if you don't know if your image is properly exposed, your camera also has an exposure meter bar. With some cameras, this is actually a meter that moves to the right and left, and with some cameras, it's just a number that goes up and down depending on the brightness of your image. If your image is too bright, it will tell you by having a plus number. You would change your camera settings and bring that number around 0, and then you would have a properly exposed image. It's truly a lifesaver, and I'll even show you how that works later. So when you're about to shoot something and you're wondering what settings to use, ask yourself, how much is my subject moving? Then set your shutter speed accordingly. Then move on to your aperture and ask yourself, what do I want in focus? And do I need a super blurry background? Then set your aperture accordingly. If you then notice your image is either too bright or too dark, set your ISO to the lowest it can possibly be, but still having a properly exposed image, and that is the exposure triangle. Okay, hopefully you have a basic understanding of that, because every technical piece of photography hinges on your knowledge of it. But the next thing that is absolutely necessary to understand is lighting. If you're shooting outdoors, which most of you probably will be, using the best lighting source of all, you'll be using the sun. Best case scenario, you shoot on a cloudy day so that it's basically shade everywhere and looks amazing, but if not, the #1 tip I can give you is to shoot at golden hour. This is the first hour of light in the morning and then the last hour of light in the evening. If I have a portrait session planned with a couple, you better believe I am scheduling it at this time because it just looks the best. It's the best time of day and will give you even lighting and some beautiful sun flares in the distance. This is how you can recreate those golden hour photos that everyone loves. You can have the best camera and the best settings, but if you stick your subject out in the middle of nowhere with the sun directly overhead, there is absolutely nothing you can do to make it look good. Choose the best time to shoot to give yourself the best lighting situation. Of course, things do happen and you might have to shoot when there's bad lighting. I've been placed in this scenario many times before, and I'm telling you, you're gonna wanna find shade so that the light is nice and even. However, if you are stuck shooting on a super sunny day, I would strongly recommend you find some shade and shoot under that. Maybe find shade from a building or a patch of trees, anything to bring your subject out of that harsh sunlight and try to keep your background darker than your subject. A white blown out background is really hard to make look good. Some of the best photos I have ever taken would be horrible if they weren't in the right lighting scenarios. And yes, lighting is that important. There are a few more things I want to talk to you about to take your photography to the next level, and the first one is lenses. Different lenses produce different looks because of the different focal lengths. Now, we do have a full video on our channel all about mastering lenses in 20 minutes if you want to take a deep dive on that topic, but just to give you some basic knowledge here too, your focal length is the number on your lens that has the mm number, and that's because it's measured in millimeters. The smaller this number, the wider your image, and the larger this number, the more zoomed in you are. The 50mm lens is the cheapest and most versatile focal length there is because it's not too wide and it's also not too tight either. You'll get the best compression or blurriness with your background, and the 50mm lens is pretty true to what real life actually looks like. Pretty much any brand, you can go pick one up for about $100. When it comes to taking photos of people, there's one thing I think a lot of photographers struggle with, and that is poses. What makes a good pose? What makes a bad pose? Well, I've been doing this for about 10 years, and I'm going to tell you how to get the perfect pose every time. First off, never shoot up at anyone, unless this is some really specific artistic approach. Shooting upwards at someone just gives them unnecessary double chins, and they will hate you and the photos. Even someone who wouldn't normally have a double chin will have one if you shoot up at them. It's probably the most unflattering angle you could possibly shoot from. General rule of thumb is to shoot slightly above eye level so your perspective is always consistent and flattering. On top of making sure your subject looks good, you also want to make sure they feel good, that they're comfortable. If this is a couple shoot and you have a married couple or an engaged couple, I typically like to joke around, keep the mood light so that everyone knows we're taking photos, but also just having fun. You want your subjects to show emotion, look like they're alive. You don't want to take photos of zombies. Capturing emotions is probably the biggest way to separate your work from everyone else's work. Emotion is the one thing that can make an awful photograph amazing. If a photo is super out of focus, grainy, looks awful, but your subject is crying, people will go on and on about how amazing of an image it is simply because the subject is portraying emotion. You've just captured this moment forever within a photograph. That being said, the number one question I get when in the middle of a portrait session is, what do I do with my hands? And for that, I have answers for you. First off, keep on hand prompts that you use regularly. With couples, I'll tell them to whisper a joke to one another, practice their first dance, do a dip kiss, twirl, something like that to provoke a response. Sure, you could just look at them and tell them to laugh, but it's better to have them tell each other a joke. After all, you want that raw emotion. With individual portraits, you can always tell them to look at the camera and smile, but I like to give them something to do that is somewhat vague so that they create that natural emotion. Secondly, add movement. Walking shots, telling a couple to dance, having a model spin in circles, all of these provoke real emotion and a natural response. Have a guy adjust his clothes or a girl play with her hair. When I'm shooting a wedding and there's a videographer shooting over my shoulder behind me, we never have the couple do something again for the video because I always use movement in my poses. This is how I shoot just about every portrait session. The poses I use are good for me, and they're also good for the videographer. That's how I've started to really incorporate movement into my posing. Finally, remember there is nothing wrong with showing the couple a pose on your phone and asking them to recreate it. I'll usually keep a few poses ready to go and even have the couple pick out which one they like the best. And be sure to snap pictures of them trying to recreate that pose because usually they'll laugh. Remember, poses are important, but the most important thing is the emotion. Next is composition. Composition should bring attention to your subject. In this photo, what is the subject? A tree? This sign? A bench? We would then use composition to bring attention to our subject. First, the rule of thirds. You're going to want to imagine this grid line over every image you take. In fact, you can even add this grid to the back of your camera to make it even easier and see it while you're shooting. All you have to do is just practice placing your key subject on these 4 intersecting points. This one looks pleasing to the eye, and then the other just kind of looks off. And that's because it's not following the rule of thirds. Depth is also super important. And no, depth is not just how blurry your background is, but it's a matter of paying attention to your foreground as well as your background. Use a tree, leaves, something in front of your lens to add some depth between you and your subject. Oftentimes, I'll even remove a flower or a tree branch from a tree around me and just shoot through it to add some foreground flair to my outdoor portraits. And that's all just foreground and it looks great, whatever, but you also need to think about your background as well. Placing your subject right against your background means no separation, and therefore it'll all just be in focus. What you're gonna wanna do is have your subject step away from your background as much as possible, really creating that distance, and it'll also make your background appear blurrier. This is the look that most people are going for. And speaking of your background, clean it up. Make sure there's nothing distracting in your background that takes your attention off your subject. Again, you want people looking at your subject, not a messy background. I would say your background is just as important, if not more important than your subject. Take advantage of symmetry, leading lines. Are there natural lines in your environment that lead your eye to the subject, like a road or a sidewalk? Try to use your background to bring the viewer's attention to your subject. Don't let it be a distraction. The difference between this shot and this shot is drastic because the first one kind of just looks like I threw it together. In the second shot, I use the rule of thirds, create depth with the foreground and leading lines to bring your attention directly to the subject. Don't just throw someone into the middle of a frame. Look around you and use your composition to your advantage. Next is flash photography. I never use that stupid flash on top of the camera that makes everything look terrible. Put that thing away or tape it down. Never use your pop-up flash. Some flashes you can buy have what's called a TTL mode, which basically makes the flash completely automatic and it exposes for you. But honestly, I like to be in control of my light, and so I use pretty cheap flashes that are completely manual, and I set the power of the flash manually by selecting the power on the back of the device. But when I use a flash, I never point it at a subject. I always bounce it. I can set it to, let's say, 1/8 power at a wedding reception, point it upwards at the ceiling, and then bounce the light off the ceiling, giving my photos that off-camera flash look, because when you do this, it looks like the light source is actually coming from the ceiling and not from your camera. This really only works if the ceiling is not dark, so the light bounces evenly. Of course, you can also set up flashes on stands and trigger them with the remote, but there's so many moving parts to wedding days, I typically just stick my camera flash on top of my camera. If I'm just shooting indoors, I typically will find a nice window and just take pictures next to it. But if I do use a flash, I always bounce it off the walls or the ceiling. You can buy a flash like I use for around 50 bucks and it'll save you in a pinch. When it comes to white balance with videography, we would never, ever recommend using auto white balance, as the coloring may shift mid-video depending on what your camera decides to use as its color light source. But with photography, I pretty much always shoot an auto white balance because raw photos are really easy to fix when it comes to color correcting in your editing process. But if you're wanting to use manual white balance for photos, definitely go ahead and do it. But with photography, auto white balance works just fine. Also, speaking of raw photos, this is probably a no-brainer to most of you out there, but make sure your camera is set up to capture raw images and not JPEG images. Using raw files gives you way more data within each photo, resulting in, larger file size, but more importantly, an easier editing experience. I always shoot in the highest possible quality setting when it comes to photos. It's literally like shooting 4K versus 1080p with video. Shoot in RAW to give yourself way more room to work with within the edit. And speaking of editing, even more importantly than shooting is your editing. At the end of the day, you've got to remember that anyone out there that has the same camera as you and the same lens as you can technically take the same photo as you. For instance, there's thousands of pictures of the New York City skyline, and of course composition and framing is super important, but the colors and the way your photo looks and feels can be even more important than the photo itself. Using presets in Lightroom is a game changer with photography. Presets in Lightroom are just arrangements of settings that you can paste onto an image to bring out its fullest potential. Editing is not just to correct mistakes in your photos, but to also enhance your photos. Make your colors pop. Are your greens not green enough? Adjust your hue. Some photos have more emotion if they're edited darker or black and white. In fact, presets are so important that we're even going to give 2 presets away in the description of this video, one that's in color and will provide a good base for you to begin your edit, and one that's in black and white for all of those more emotional images you might capture. Because you have to remember, style is so important when it comes to photography. Most of the photographers whose work you see online and you love, they all shoot on the same cameras and lenses that you can use, but their edits are what make their work look so much more different. For example, here is a raw photo, and here is that same photo edited with a specific style in mind. This film style look is super interesting and makes the photo really pop because it was edited to make you feel that way. This photo wasn't taken on film, but it still has that vintage look because of post-production and editing. One easy way to achieve this look is just by messing with your toned curve. Kind of get a good S shape in there, and then add some grain, really dive deep into the colors, make the shadows a little green or pink, depending on what you're looking for. You get to determine your creative style when editing, so really spend some time developing your own presets and make your own photos pop. Inside our photography course, we go into more detail on this and even give you some Lightroom presets to get you started. Definitely spend a ton of time really diving into your editing style and make something that you are proud of. All right, I'm gonna take you guys with me outside and I'm going to show you in a real time, real environment, how to get the correct exposure. Then we'll come back here and I'll share some more stuff with you. All right, so we are outside. I'm gonna show you guys in real time how to get the correct exposure. Now, sometimes you might be in a situation like this where you're in a parking lot and it doesn't really look that great, but the first thing you're gonna wanna do is find good lighting. So I have our subject over here in the shade up against these trees over here. And sometimes you might, look at your subject and now you look at your camera and it's completely white. Well, I'm gonna show you how to fix that. Obviously, first thing you're gonna wanna do is ask, how fast is my subject moving? Well, she's not moving at all. So my shutter speed doesn't really matter. I'm just gonna kind of boost it up to like 2000 since we're outside. And then she's up against the wall. So I'm gonna put my aperture at like 1.8. And now my ISO is at 3200, and quite frankly, this is just too bright. So I'm gonna bring this down. Yeah, 400 looks good. And there you have it, correct exposure. So yeah, the exposure looks good, but the shot itself is a little bit boring. So I'm actually now gonna add some composition into it and kind of give the shot just a little bit more flair. So I already set my exposure for this, so it actually looks pretty good. I think it might just be a tad bit too dark. So I'm gonna just bring my shutter down to like 1600. And just like that. Getting a little bit of the light from the sun in there, some leading lines, and then look right here, Haley. Kind of tilt your head down a little bit this way. There you go. All right, so now we're at our second location. Again, we're looking for shade because we're shooting at around noon and the light looks really bad everywhere else. So we're looking for shade in taking these photos. Looking right here, obviously my settings are off and it's really dark. And so what we're gonna do is first we're gonna bring the shutter down to about 500. My f-stop is way too high, so we're gonna bring that down all the way to 1.8. It's still a little bright, so I'm gonna boost my shutter back up. And then my ISO can be at around 200 because you wanna keep that as low as possible. And then look right here, Haley. Perfect. Now the shot's a little bit boring, so what I could do is use a leaf and add some like foreground into it, so that's what I'm gonna do. Just like that. And so now what you can do is kind of just take this little leaf and put it in front of your lens. And you kind of have to experiment a little bit to try to get, you know, enough of it in there without it looking weird. Yeah, like that. Perfect. All right, and so for our last example, again, it's super bright. So what I'm gonna do is bring my ISO as low as possible, about 200. My shutter is really, really low, and so it's letting a ton of light into the lens. So I'm gonna raise this up to about 800, looks good. Kind of look off to the side. And now this shot's cool, but I really wanna show more creativity. So I'm gonna use these rails for leading lines. And so instead of that first picture, I'm gonna kind of position the shot right here. And this is just to kind of show that composition really is that important. Again, getting the correct exposure is crucial, but on top of that, you should also be using your rules of composition to use your surroundings, look for railings, look for leaves, stuff to shoot through, and give yourself that just more creative look by using composition to aid to your image. So there you have it. In just about 20 minutes, I have given you everything you need to know to start taking some incredible photos. You can always set your camera on auto and just go have some fun, but if you apply all of these steps to your photography, you will be able to create professional looking images, and maybe you'll even start to get hired by all of your friends and family. Who knows, maybe even be able to make a really good side hustle with your new hobby. So I promise once you get started and begin the trial and error portion of learning how to use your camera, the rest is really easy. Starting and beginning is truly the hardest part. I hope this video has helped you guys out and you feel a little bit more confident going into your next shoot, or maybe even your very first shoot. The tips and tricks I've shared with you are just the beginning. If you'd like to learn even more about mastering photography, you can check out our full course at tomorrowsfilmmakers.com. We have a full photography course where we dive deep into the business side with weddings, portraits, websites, marketing, and dive deep into the editing side as well. We have over 1,200 training videos and over 120 hours of content on every single aspect of filmmaking and photography you can possibly imagine. This is all included with lifetime access, all for just 97 bucks. We even have some presets for Adobe Lightroom to download for free within our course, and several other tools to help you get started. We created Tomorrow's Filmmakers with the goal of helping as many people as possible learn filmmaking and photography for an affordable price so that people like you can succeed. We have experts in every category teaching on specific topics all the way from the basics to the advanced. Learn the best from the best. If you're just getting started in photography, or if you'd like to learn more, check out tomorrowsfilmmakers.com if you want to learn all the skills that you need to succeed.